Hi guys, and welcome to another 7-minute lecture. Should we overthrow dictators? Do we as an international community have a responsibility to protect the world from evil leaders? That's what we're going to consider today. Firstly, do we even have a clear idea of what a dictator is? This might seem like a silly question, but it's actually a very important one, because for us to consider the possibility of removing dictators from power, we need to have a very firm understanding of what the term actually means. And here, of course, as we all know, there's so much confusion over what dictator even means, and it serves no real purpose today. The most common definition I've heard is that it's a leader who takes power through the use of force and then exercises absolute power. Others say it doesn't matter how they came to power, what matters is whether they exercise total control or not. The term in modern politics is simply, unfortunately, something that's thrown around to describe a political leader that you despise. Some refer to Vladimir Putin, for instance, as a dictator, and others very vehemently deny it, given his local popularity. I've seen Lee Kuan Yew, the former leader of Singapore, being called a dictator, even though he was voted into power legally. I've even seen people call Donald Trump a dictator, despite the fact that he won like everyone else, conspiracy theories notwithstanding. I myself referred to North Korean leaders as dictators in one of my previous videos, despite two of them being hereditary leaders and didn't assume power through force. So there doesn't seem to be a globally accepted definition for what exactly a dictator is, which makes the idea of there being a global responsibility to overthrow dictators very problematic. Even if we get past this, who then overthrows the dictators? Does it have to be some kind of international effort, or can individual countries use this supposed responsibility to act by themselves? If it's going to be a unilateral decision, then what happens when nations act in their own self-interest and destabilize the region even more? An easy example of this, some would say, is the 2003 invasion of Iraq, led by the USA and the UK. It was initially couched in this some kind of rhetoric about WMDs, but pretty soon it became about regime change, right? And it took almost no time for the conflict to become highly unpopular, both internally and externally. People in the USA and UK started asking themselves if it was really their place to do this. And unlike something like the Vietnam War, where it took years for any serious mass protest movement to start, in the case of Iraq, it started almost instantly. And the global image and goodwill of the USA and UK was largely squandered by this as well. Perhaps as testament to what a mess that entire thing was, even the highly fractured political divide in the United States seems to somehow be united on this now, where Democrat voters trash on George Bush for having done it, and now even the pro-Trump Republican voters trash the idea. So despite the fact that Saddam Hussein was a textbook example of a dictator, so we bypass the complications posed in the first question, despite that, the entire thing was a regional and international disaster diplomatically and strategically, because the question of whose responsibility is it to overthrow the dictators was not answered satisfactorily. We then need to consider the consequences, repercussions of overthrowing dictators, right? Because what we've seen from modern examples is that no matter how brutal the dictators are, there needs to be serious post-conflict work done to prevent those places from just spiraling into chaos with power vacuums. Two examples of recent regime change to highlight this would be the NATO campaign in Libya and the American campaign in Afghanistan. In both cases, our earlier questions were pretty much satisfactorily answered. Gaddafi and Mullah Omar / the Taliban were unquestionably dictatorial forces, so the first requirement was satisfied. And the international community at the time of intervention was in support of these interventions as well. So the first two issues were sorted. And yet, look at the consequences and the power vacuum that it inevitably created. In the case of Libya, The country has been embroiled in a series of civil wars to this day, and in Afghanistan, it looks even worse, where after nearly 20 years of trying to defeat the Taliban, the Americans are now forced to not only negotiate with them, but it very much looks like Afghanistan will have to be ruled by them as well. So even if you overthrow dictators, rebuilding these countries is more or less an impossible task, because the international community keeps wanting to rebuild them in the Western image. They keep trying to rebuild these countries into parliamentary democracies, despite the fact that the local culture and people are simply not interested in adopting these Western models into their own ways of life. Finally, we need to look at the legal position as well. As we know, or should know, international law is very weak and it's a hazy instrument. It's more or less a formality as far as the larger powers are concerned. None of them really follow it. But international law does quite clearly prohibit regime change under most circumstances. You have Article 51 of the UN Charter, which says that you can interfere, which might even extend to invading another country, as long as it's for self-defense, as long as it's to protect yourself. And countries usually tend to cite Article 51 whenever they try to create a legal justification for invading another country or overthrowing a dictator. But most of these excuses typically fall flat. You also have the doctrine of R2P, responsibility to protect, that was adopted by the UN in 2005, which essentially says that you can intervene in another country in order to prevent really grave crimes like genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Overthrowing Gaddafi in Libya was the first case where the UN Security Council cited the R2P doctrine to overthrow a dictator. But since the Libyan experiment has since then turned into total chaos, the future of this doctrine is quite uncertain as well. Some try to invoke this later to overthrow the Assad regime in Syria, but it no longer worked. The UN didn't buy that. So legally, we don't have a clear-cut legal position either. And those are some of what I consider to be the most important issues on this overall question of whether we should overthrow dictators. The definition, the saviors, the consequences, and the law. If you like content like this, please don't forget to share and subscribe. Thank you, take care, and I'll see you soon.